Proof of work is that protocol in Bitcoin to avoid Sybil attacks based on requiring computing power to participate in validating and mining blocks. Let's get an intuition again why this is actually required for proper working of the Bitcoin network. So we have some network nodes, they're connected in some way, and initially we said we just randomly choose one node to validate a block, and that validator gets some reward. And in such a case, everyone has an incentive to just spam the network, create multiple nodes, because it's easy to just create public keys and then increase their chances of being selected. So we don't want that, and for that we need to make it somehow based on a resource that is hard to monopolize. And in this case, it's computing power. So let's say this node controls 50% of the total computing power in the network. In such a case, that node should be selected about 50% of the times to validate a block. In this case, it's not beneficial to spam the network anymore. I mean, this person here controlling 50% of the total computing power could still create more nodes, let's say 4 more. So this bunch here is basically all the same person, but then he or she also would probably split her computing power evenly to 10% of each node. And then, of course, in total, she's still going to be selected about 50% for each block. So, I mean, sometimes the reward will land here, sometimes it will land here, but in total, it's about 50% when she's going to be selected for validating a block. So that would be just not be very beneficial, right? You better just keep your whole computing power available, invested in one node, and keep it simple. So the idea is quite simple. Let's look at the requirements in more detail, and then later on let's see how it actually works. So first, this mechanism needs to be somehow parameterizable. The difficulty must be adjustable. Why? Well, you suspect that the computing power will increase over time in the network. More and more people will join the network and hook up their laptops or other hardware to mine blocks. And as this pool of computing power increases, the difficulty of mining blocks, so the work requirement to find one, needs to increase. Otherwise, we're just finding blocks more and more quickly, and the time interval between blocks will steadily decrease. We want to keep the time interval between blocks constant, and for that we need to adjust that difficulty level of finding new blocks. Then the chance of finding a block must be proportional to the share of total computing power someone controls. This is just a fairness concern. If you put in a lot of work into the network, you should also be rewarded proportionally to that. And lastly, the work you did to find a new block must be easy to verify. Other people need to be sure that you actually did the work to get the reward. So how does it actually work? The whole thing is based on hash puzzles. In case you don't remember the properties of hash functions, please review the previous video. So it comes down to finding a nonce. This is just an arbitrary string of characters, and if you concatenate them together with the previous hash of the previous block and all the transactions in the current block, they should meet some target. This may all sound very cryptic right now, but let's have a closer look. So we have here our current blockchain header, the newest block in our chain, and goes back in time here. And now we want to append a new block. So we have here a collection of transactions, and we have a hash pointer to the previous one. And now we need to find this X, this nonce, we can add here in this blockchain structure, such that if we put all that information into a hash function, concatenate it together, so that just means we merge them. So we have the hash pointer, all transactions linked together. So this is going to be a long string, plus that x we're trying to find, such that the output of this hash function is going to be within the limits of some target. But what's up with that target? What does that actually mean? So we have some hash function, and you have then a set of all possible outputs of that hash function. And it could look something like this. Now it depends on what exact hash function you're using and the encoding, but this is an example here. Okay, so this is all the possible outputs of that function. And this is a huge set, in fact. So we're going to restrict the goal here to a small subset of all possible outputs. Now, how can we do that? Well, for example, we could say, oh, I want to generate a output string such that some digits in the beginning have a predetermined character. So I could say, okay, I want to get an output with 3 zeros in the beginning. And that will increase the difficulty, right? The more zeros, in fact it can be any other character as well. I could also say, well, let me find something with 3 nines in the beginning. But in fact, in Bitcoin, this is done with zeros in the beginning. So it gets harder and harder to find that exact output. It's easiest to find just any output where you have no restriction, right? You can just put in anything and then the output will be valid. Then if you require 1 zero in the beginning, it gets harder. Then you just have to find 1 zero in the beginning, and then the rest can vary. It can be anything. And then it gets harder and harder up until you have 64 zeros to find. And that would be really, really, really hard because you're just trying to find one single possible value in this huge set of possible outputs of the hash function. So this difficulty level is adjusted over time to keep the block interval around 10 minutes. Fewer zeros in the beginning means it's easier, and more zeros in the beginning means it's harder. Currently, miners need to find a hash output with around 18 zeros in the beginning. So that's already quite hard. Now, if suddenly people would leave the mining pool, then the block interval would increase, right? Because given the decrease in computing power in the network, the time to find the hash would increase. And if nodes observe that, they would decrease the difficulty level. So it could actually be that the required zeros would decrease in case the computing power available in the network would decrease. And of course the other way around. If even more people would join the mining network, the required zeros would increase. Now, because of the property of hash functions that the output is generated randomly, there's no better strategy for miners to just try randomly inputs to this hash function, to this x, to meet that target. That's the actual work in the proof of work mechanism. You try all kinds of possible inputs for that hash function such that the output meets that target. And if you actually find that x, that nonce, you're then able to append that block, get the reward, and so you fill in that x, whatever it may be, and then because these hash functions are collision free, everyone else in the network can just verify that you actually did the work. So they just take this whole information, the previous hash, then all the transactions, plus that nonce you provided, put it in the hash function, and they check if actually the output meets that requirement, which we specified to 3 zeros in that case, instead of here these 3 characters. So we meet all the requirements. The difficulty level is adjustable by increasing or decreasing the amount of zeros at the beginning of the target output. Then the chance of finding a block is proportional to the available computing power. That's simply because if you have more computing power available, you can try out more possible inputs for x in the same amount of time, such that your chance of finding a correct x is higher. And then finally, the work is verifiable, simply because hash functions are collision-free. So all the other nodes can always just put in all the information here, plus the nonce you provided, and verify that you found a correct output.